The moment Opal Garner stepped off the stagecoach in Redemption Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1874, a gunshot cracked through the afternoon air and sent every living soul on that dusty Main Street diving for cover, every soul except her. She stood perfectly still in the middle of the road, her worn leather traveling bag gripped in both hands, her dark hair half escaped from its pins, her green eyes scanning the chaos with the calm expression of a woman who had already survived far worse than a stray bullet. Dust billowed up around her boots. Men scrambled behind water troughs and barrel stacks. The stagecoach driver cursed and flattened himself across the driver's box. And Opal Garner simply watched, her jaw set, her heart steady, as two men sprinted out of the bank across the street and thundered past her on horseback, nearly clipping her shoulder. It was only after they disappeared around the far corner that she exhaled slowly and looked down at the street around her. "You all right, ma'am?" A voice called from somewhere to her left. She turned. A man was rising from behind a water trough, one hand pressed to the brim of a dark hat, the other still loosely holding a revolver at his side. He was tall, with broad shoulders that strained slightly against his worn chambray shirt, a jaw shadowed with a few days of dark stubble, and eyes the color of creek water in shadow, that particular shade of gray-green that shifts depending on the light. He looked at her with an expression caught between professional assessment and something else, something quieter that he seemed to be actively suppressing. "I'm perfectly fine," Opal said, brushing a smudge of dust from the front of her traveling dress. "Are they going to catch those men?" The tall man holstered his revolver and stepped toward her, glancing down the road in the direction the riders had gone. "Deputy Crane went after them. Whether he catches them is another question." He looked back at her, his brow drawing together slightly. "You're not from here." "No," she said. "I'm from Missouri." Opal Garner, she offered her hand. He took it, and she noticed the roughness of his palm, the careful way he gripped her hand, firm but measured, the way a man grips something he doesn't want to break. "Elias Redmond," he said. "I'm the sheriff." She glanced at the badge on his chest that she should have noticed before. "Of course you are," she said. He almost smiled. "What brings you to Redemption Creek, Miss Garner?" She looked down the length of the main street, taking in the general store with its faded painted sign, the saloon with its swinging doors slightly off their hinges, the livery at the far end, the small white church just visible past the edge of town where it sat on a gentle rise. The town was rough but not hopeless. There was something about it, something about the wide open sky above it, the smell of cedar and dry grass, the way the afternoon light turned the dusk golden, that struck her as a place where things could still be made right. "I've come to teach," she said. "The town council hired me. I'm to run the school." Elias Redmond looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "Is that so?" he said, not quite a question. "Welcome to Redemption Creek, Miss Garner. I'll show you to Mrs. Hollis's boarding house." She fell into step beside him, and neither of them noticed, not yet, that it already felt entirely natural. Opal had not come to Redemption Creek looking for anything other than a fresh start. She was 26 years old, educated at a women's college in Columbia, Missouri, where she had studied teaching and literature, and had developed strong opinions about both. She had been engaged once, 2 years prior, to a man named Theodore Hatch, who had turned out to be simultaneously engaged to 2 other women and in debt to half a dozen more. The experience had sharpened her instincts considerably and softened exactly nothing about her character. She was not bitter, but she was careful. Mrs. Hollis's boarding house was a 2-story whitewashed building at the edge of the main street, with a vegetable garden in the back and curtains in every window that suggested someone cared deeply about appearances. Harriet Hollis herself was a stout woman in her 50s with iron-gray hair and the alert eyes of someone who had run a boarding house long enough to identify trouble before it unpacked its bags. She looked Opal over with frank assessment when Elias brought her to the door, and then she smiled broadly as if something she had been waiting for had finally arrived. "Schoolteacher," she said, taking Opal's bag from her hand without asking. "Good. Those children are half feral, Come in, come in. I'll make coffee." Elias tipped his hat at Opal from the doorstep. "I'll leave you to it, Miss Garner. If you need anything, the sheriff's office is the 4th building down on the left." "Thank you, Sheriff," she said, and watched him walk back up the street with a long, unhurried stride that covered a good deal of ground without appearing to rush. "Don't let him fool you," Harriet said from inside the hall. Opal turned. "I beg your pardon. Elias Redmond. He looks like a man who has everything figured out." Harriet set the bag down at the foot of the stairs and headed toward the back of the house. "He doesn't. Come on, then. Coffee." Opal followed, filing the remark away alongside everything else she was quietly cataloging about this new place. The schoolhouse sat at the opposite end of town from the church, a single-room building with a plank floor that had warped in 3 places, 4 rows of bench seats, a chalkboard that had seen better decades, and 12 panes of glass in its 2 windows, of which 7 were intact. Opal arrived at 6 in the morning on her second day in Redemption Creek and spent the first 3 hours before any students arrived sweeping, ordering the broken benches to one side, redistributing the seating so that the gaps were less obvious, and writing the alphabet across the top of the chalkboard in large, careful letters. She was halfway up a stepladder trying to rehang a section of the window frame that had worked itself loose when the door opened behind her. "You should have asked someone to help with that." She recognized the voice without turning. "I was not aware that asking for help was a prerequisite for being allowed to do things myself, Sheriff." She heard him step inside. "It's not a prerequisite. It's just that ladder looks unsteady." "The ladder is fine." She set the last nail and came down the steps carefully. Elias Redmond was standing just inside the door with a toolbox in one hand, looking at the renovations she had already accomplished with an expression she could not quite read. "Did you come to inspect my ladder technique, or was there another reason? Mrs. Holly sent word that you were here early and she thought the window frame needed fixing." He held up the toolbox. "I'm the closest thing this town has to a carpenter on days when Hector Velez is busy at the ranch." Opal looked at the toolbox, then at him. "All right," she said. "The frame is already done, but the left window pane is cracked and the middle bench in the second row is about to lose a leg." He got to work without commentary, which she appreciated. She continued sorting through the pile of readers and primers that had been left in a wooden crate in the corner, making notes in a small notebook about what she had, what she lacked, and what she would need to request from the county office. They worked in comfortable silence for a good quarter hour before he spoke again. "How long have you been teaching?" "For years," she said, without looking up from the notebook. "Jefferson County before this. Before that I spent a year helping at a freedmen's school in Missouri after the war." A pause. "That must have been something." "It was," she said, and looked up then, because she wanted to see his face when she said the next part. "The school was burned down by men who didn't believe those children deserved to read." She watched his expression carefully. "I went back and reopened it in the building next door." He held her gaze. Something moved through his expression, not surprise exactly, more like recognition. "Is that what you're doing here, starting over somewhere that needs it?" "Every place needs it," she said. "This one asked." He went back to the bench, fitted the leg with quiet efficiency, and said nothing else for a while. But she noticed that when he left the toolbox. The children of Redemption Creek arrived on Monday morning in varying states of preparation and enthusiasm. There were 18 of them, ranging from age 6 to 14, from the ranching families on the surrounding land and from the town itself, and they came speaking English and Spanish in roughly equal measure. Opal had anticipated this and had spent Sunday afternoon at Mrs. Holly's kitchen table working through the small Spanish dictionary she had packed in the bottom of her bag. The first week was controlled chaos. By the second week, it was merely chaos. By the third week, something that could genuinely be called order had begun to emerge, and Opal found herself arriving at the schoolhouse each morning with something she recognized as joy. Elias Redmond walked past the schoolhouse most mornings on his rounds, and she began to notice the slight variation in his route that meant he was passing the window at a time when classes were in session. She did not acknowledge this out loud. She was not ready to, and she suspected he was not either. What she knew of him she had gathered in pieces from Mrs. Holly's, who offered information the way a river offers stones. You had to watch for them and pick them out yourself. Elias had been sheriff in Redemption Creek for 3 years. Before that, he had been a ranch hand on the Marlow spread north of town. Before that, he had fought in the war on the Union side, which in this part of Texas was not a fact he advertised but which Mrs. Holly's had offered with a meaningful look. He had been briefly married, years ago, to a woman named Clara who had died of fever in their first winter together. He had not in the years since given any indication of looking for someone else. He closed himself up, Harriet said one evening, pouring coffee at the kitchen table after supper. Not mean about it. Not cold exactly, just closed. Opal wrapped both hands around her cup. People have reasons. They do, Harriet agreed. Doesn't mean the reasons have to last forever. Opal looked into her coffee and said nothing. It was the end of April when the situation with the Garfield brothers came to a head. Opal knew about the Garfields in the general way that everyone in Redemption Creek knew about them. 2 brothers, Wade and Cole, who ran a cattle operation to the south and had a habit of running it over the edges of other people's property and patients. They were not quite outlaws, but they occupied the uncomfortable territory just adjacent to that designation, close enough that honest people avoided their company. The trouble started when Miguel Reyes, the father of 2 of Opal's students, was found to have a section of fence on his property torn down and 60 of his cattle run off, replaced with a note in large, unsteady letters that said the land was not his to hold. Miguel Reyes had homesteaded that land legally 4 years ago. He had the papers from the county land office to prove it. He was also Mexican-born, which the Garfield brothers appeared to believe was sufficient reason to disregard those papers entirely. Opal was walking back from the schoolhouse on the afternoon when Miguel came to the sheriff's office, and she happened to be passing when she heard the raised voices. She stopped outside the open window without quite deciding to eavesdrop, and then because what she heard was important, she stayed. "I have the papers, Sheriff. They are recorded at the county office. I have not broken any law." Miguel's voice was steady but tight with the particular tension of a man who has had to make this argument before. "I know." Elias' voice was flat and certain. "And I'm going to ride out there today and make that very clear to Wade Garfield. He will not listen." "He doesn't have to listen. He has to comply with the law. Those are different things." A silence. Then Miguel said quietly, "They burned my neighbor's fence last summer, and when he complained they said he had started it. I cannot afford to lose those cattle." "You won't lose them." Elias' voice had dropped, and it carried a weight that Opal recognized as something more than professional obligation. "I give you my word." Opal moved away from the window before she could be seen listening, but she carried that moment with her all the way back to the boarding house, turning it over, examining the shape of it. A man who made promises he intended to keep was a particular kind of rare. The following day she was in the middle of a reading lesson when she saw Elias ride past on his horse, a solid bay with a white blaze heading south. He was alone. Deputy Crane was visible a moment later, moving in the same direction. She watched them until the trail bent and they disappeared behind the cottonwood trees at the creek, and she made herself look back at the class, and she told herself the slight tightness in her chest was nothing at all. They came back that afternoon. No one had been shot. Wade Garfield had been presented with the legal paperwork and informed, apparently in terms that left no room for alternate interpretation, that any further interference with the Reyes property would result in consequences of a specifically legal nature. Deputy Crane told the story at the saloon that evening, and by morning it had reached Mrs. Holly's, who told Opal over breakfast with considerable satisfaction. "He does that," Harriet said. "When he decides something is right, he goes after it directly, no meandering." Opal spread butter on her bread and said nothing. The rain came in May, 3 days of it, steady and soaking, the kind that turned the creek into a running declaration and softened the hard-baked ruts of the main street into a treacherous series of small lakes. On the second evening of rain, Opal was walking back from the general store with a bundle of paper she had purchased for the school when her boot found a rut that was deeper than it looked, and she went down, catching herself on one knee, the paper scattering. Here, a hand appeared in front of her face. She looked up. Elias was there, coat dark with rain, already bending to collect the scattered pages. She took his hand and he pulled her upright with an ease that was matter-of-fact rather than theatrical. "Thank you," she said, embarrassed in the purely practical way of someone who prefers not to need rescuing. "Ground's treacherous tonight." He straightened and held out the recovered papers, which were only slightly damp at the edges. "You should have a lamp." The lamp at the store was already claimed. She took the papers and tucked them under her arm. Rain was running steadily off the brim of his hat. She was getting soaked through her coat. Neither of them moved immediately. "Were you heading somewhere?" "Back to the office." He glanced up at the sky, which offered no useful information. "I can walk you to Hollis's first. It's in the opposite direction." "I know," he said, and that was all. They walked through the rain together, and because the street was mostly empty on account of the weather, there was no one to perform for, no audience of town opinion to manage. It was just the rain and the dark and the yellow squares of light from the windows they passed. He matched his pace to hers. She noticed that he didn't fill the silence with unnecessary words, and she found she liked that about him very much. At the door of the boarding house, she turned to thank him. He was looking at her with that same expression she had caught before, the one he seemed to keep under deliberate management but which occasionally slipped past the boundary he'd set for it. "Miss Garner," he said, and then stopped. "Opal," she said, "we've been acquainted long enough for that." Something shifted in his expression. "Opal," he said, and her name sounded different in his voice. She couldn't have explained exactly how, only that it did. "Good night." "Good night, Elias." She went inside. She stood in the hallway for a moment in her wet coat, listening to the rain, and she was smiling without quite meaning to. June arrived with heat and clarity. The school term had settled into a rhythm that Opal found deeply satisfying. Her students were learning. Young Rosa Reyes, Miguel's 7-year-old daughter, had gone from barely reading to working through a whole primer on her own. Tomás, who was 12 and the oldest Reyes child, had proved to have a gift for numbers that Opal was quietly encouraging with problems that stretched past what the curriculum required. There were others, James Holcomb, whose ranching father had assumed school was mostly useless, but who had been surprised into silence when his son wrote a letter home that was both grammatically sound and genuinely moving. Ruthie Crane, the deputy's daughter, who drew pictures in the margins of everything but listened to every word Opal said. Outside of school hours, Redemption Creek continued its particular rhythm, and Opal continued to find her place within it. She attended church on Sundays, where she sang with more enthusiasm than technical precision, and where Reverend Ames delivered sermons that were occasionally brilliant and frequently too long. She helped Harriet with the vegetable garden on Tuesday afternoons. She began sitting on the boarding house porch in the evenings with a book, which had the incidental effect of allowing her to watch the quiet movement of the main street below without appearing to be watching for anything specific. Elias took to stopping on his evening rounds. Just briefly. A word about the day, a remark about town business, sometimes nothing at all for a few minutes while he leaned against the porch rail and looked out at the street in the fading light. It was comfortable in the way that things are comfortable when they've happened enough times to feel natural, and she was aware that something was building between them with the slow, determined patience of a river carving stone. What she did not expect was for it to be interrupted by her past. The letter arrived on a Thursday in mid-June, postmarked from Kansas City, in handwriting she recognized immediately. Theodore Hatch, composed of equal parts charm and disaster, had somehow discovered her whereabouts and had written to tell her that he had mended his ways, that he missed her particularly, and that he intended to come to Redemption Creek in the next weeks to demonstrate the sincerity of his reformation. Opal read the letter twice in the privacy of her room and then sat with it in her hands for a long time. She was not frightened of Theodore. She was not even particularly angry, the way she had once been. What she felt was a dull, tired irritation at the interruption, and beneath that, something closer to clarity. She did not want Theodore Hatch, not the reformed version any more than the original. She had moved past that particular chapter of her life with some effort, and she had no intention of reopening it. She did not tell Elias. She told herself it was not his business, which was technically true and practically incomplete, because the real reason was that she was not yet sure what she wanted Elias Redmond's business to include. Theodore arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in late June, exactly as promised and significantly less reformed than advertised. He was a handsome man in an obvious, well-maintained way, with fair hair that he wore slightly long and a smile that had been calibrated over years to produce a specific, reliable effect on people. He stepped off the stagecoach in a city suit that was conspicuously wrong for the dust and heat of Redemption Creek, and he found Opal at the general store within 20 minutes of arriving, which suggested he had asked after her immediately. Opal. He said her name with enormous warmth, as though they were resuming a pleasant conversation rather than concluding one that had ended 2 years ago in mutual humiliation. Theodore. She finished counting the stack of composition books she was purchasing and tucked them under her arm. "I received your letter. I hope it was welcome." "It was informative," she said. He fell into step beside her as she left the store, undiscouraged. He was good at undiscouragedness, she remembered. It was one of his more annoying qualities. He spoke about his time in Kansas City, his business ventures, how well he was doing, how he had spent considerable time reflecting and arriving at the conclusion that she had been the great loss of his life, and he intended to rectify that. "I'm not available to be rectified," she said pleasantly. "You're not engaged or anything of that nature," he said with the easy confidence of a man who fully expected the answer to be no. "No," she said, because it was true. "Then I don't see why we can't at least have supper and talk." She declined supper. She declined it again the following morning when he appeared at the schoolhouse after classes let out, and again that evening when he positioned himself on the main street in the hope of intercepting her return from the schoolhouse. He was persistent in the manner of someone who had almost always gotten what he wanted through persistence, and had not yet received sufficient counter-evidence. Elias noticed on the second day. She could tell from the way his expression changed slightly when he saw Theodore walking beside her on the main street, not jealousy exactly, or not only that, but the careful, professional attention of a man who made it his business to know when something in his town had shifted. He came to her that evening on the boarding house porch, and this time he did not lean against the rail and look at the street. He sat in the other porch chair and looked at her. "Who's the man in the city clothes?" he asked. "Someone from my past." She kept her eyes on her book, then acknowledged that she was not actually reading it and set it in her lap. "His name is Theodore Hatch. He has come under the impression that I might be persuaded to resume a prior acquaintance." A silence. "Is he right?" She looked at him squarely. "No, but he is not yet convinced of that." Elias was quiet for a moment, his hat resting on his knee. "Do you need me to speak to him?" "In what capacity?" she asked carefully. He met her eyes. "Whatever capacity would be useful." She held his gaze for a moment, feeling the weight of the half-said thing between them, the thing they had been circling for months. "I can handle Theodore Hatch," she said, "but thank you." He nodded once and settled back, and they sat together in the evening quiet, and she was very aware of the particular specific distance between his chair and hers, and how easily it could be closed. Theodore's visit reached its crisis on Saturday evening. Opal had agreed, against her better judgment, to take supper at the restaurant with him, reasoning that a clear and definitive conversation in a public setting would accomplish more than repeated brief refusals. She stated her position clearly over the soup course. She did not wish to resume their acquaintance. She bore him no ill will. She sincerely hoped he would find happiness with someone better suited to him, and she expected this to be the end of the matter. Theodore, who had drunk a fair amount of whiskey before the meal, received this information poorly. He did not raise his voice. He was not physically threatening, but he became the kind of unpleasant that certain men become when told something they have decided they should not be told, stubborn and sulky, and pointed in his language, referring to her choices as naive and her new life as an adventure that would wear thin. Opal excused herself from the table with perfect composure, paid for her own soup, and walked out. She was on the street, 3 steps from the restaurant door, when she nearly collided with Elias, who was apparently on his evening round and who stopped when he saw her face. "Are you all right?" he said. "Quite fine," she said, and her voice was steadier than her hands, which she clasped in front of her. "I've just concluded supper." He looked at the restaurant door and then back at her. "He upset you?" "He tried to." She drew a breath. "He succeeded somewhat, I won't pretend otherwise." Elias was very still for a moment, then he said, "Walk with me." They walked away from the restaurant and down the side street that ran along the creek, where the evening air was cooler and smelled of the water and the cottonwood trees. The light was going amber and long. She told him about Theodore, properly this time, the whole story, the other engagements, the debt, the letter, the supper. She told it simply, without embellishment, and he listened the way he did everything, with his whole attention and without interrupting. When she finished, there was a quiet moment, and then he said, "I'm sorry that happened to you." "The first time or this time?" "Both," he said. He stopped walking and she stopped beside him. The creek was running quietly a few feet away, and the last of the evening light was on the water. "I'm going to ask him to leave town tomorrow," he said. "He's not breaking any law staying, but I can ask him, firmly." "You don't have to do that," she said, but she didn't say she didn't want him to. "I know I don't have to." He was looking at the creek. Then he looked at her, and this time he didn't suppress whatever was in his expression. He let it be there, plain and careful and real. "I want to," he said, "because I would rather he was not here." She looked at him for a long moment. "Because you're the sheriff," she said, testing the edge of the thing. "Because I'm the sheriff," he agreed, "and because you are the most interesting person who has walked into this town in as long as I can remember, and I do not like watching someone who is not worthy of you try to convince you otherwise." He stopped. He seemed to realize how much he had said, and he looked back at the creek. "That was more than I intended." "Don't apologize for it," she said softly. He looked at her again. The evening was very quiet. "Opal." "I know," she said. She did know. She had known for a while. The shape of this thing between them was not complicated, only cautious, the way things are cautious when they matter enough to be worth getting right. She reached out and put her hand over his where it rested at his side. He turned his hand over and held hers, and they stood like that for a moment by the creek in the warm Texas evening, and it was both entirely simple and exactly enough. Theodore Hatch left on the Monday morning stagecoach, after a conversation with Elias in the sheriff's office that none of Redemption Creek's citizens were privileged to hear, but the results of which were universally noticed. He left without fanfare and without looking back, and the town closed over his absence the way water closes over a stone, smoothly and completely. What remained was the simpler, better thing. Elias and Opal began walking together on Sunday afternoons, following the creek path north of town, where the cottonwoods stood thick and cool, and the water ran clear over flat limestone. They talked about everything. She told him about Missouri and her college years and the freedmen's school, and what it had cost her to go back and open it again. He told her about the war, not the battles exactly, but the particular experience of being a young man from Texas who had chosen the Union side, and what that had meant for his relationships with nearly everyone he knew, and how he had come to Redemption Creek afterward, partly because no one there had known him before. He told her about Clara, quietly and without hedging, because she had asked him directly, and he seemed to recognize that she was someone who could hold the information without misusing it. He loved her, he said. Her death had made a specific kind of hole. He had spent a long time not looking at anything he might fill it with, because that had felt like a betrayal, and then longer still before he understood that keeping himself empty was not a tribute but simply an absence. "I don't know that I expected anyone again," he said one afternoon, seated on a flat rock by the water, his hat on his knee. "I stopped thinking about it mostly." "And now?" she asked. He looked at her steadily. "Now I think about it considerably more than mostly." She smiled at that, a real smile, not the composed, practical one she deployed for general use, but the one that reached her eyes and changed her whole face. He seemed to find it remarkable. She could tell by the way he looked at her just after, with the slightly stunned expression of a man encountering something he hadn't anticipated. She leaned her shoulder against his. He put his arm around her. They sat by the creek for another hour, talking and not talking in equal measure, and it was the most at home she had felt since she stepped off the stagecoach and into the crossfire on the main street of this improbable, necessary town. It was Harriet who first said what everyone in Redemption Creek had already decided was inevitable. She said it over breakfast on a morning in July without looking up from her eggs, as though she were commenting on the weather. "He's going to ask you to marry him." Opal set down her coffee cup. "Did he say something to you?" "He doesn't say things," Harriet said. "He does them. I can tell by how he does them." She looked up. "Are you going to say yes?" Opal was quiet for a moment. She thought about the creek afternoons, and the rainy walk and the porch evenings, and the moment he had said her name for the first time as though it meant something. She thought about the toolbox he had left in the schoolhouse and had never asked for back, which she had come to think of as an entirely accidental metaphor for the whole of him. She thought about the steadiness of him, the particular quality of his attention, the way he made promises he intended to keep. "Yes," she said simply. "I'm going to say yes." Harriet went back to her eggs with the satisfied expression of someone whose prediction had just been confirmed. "Good. He's been solitary long enough." He did ask her, but not in a way that resembled any asking she might have predicted. He did not produce a ring in the restaurant or make a speech in the town square. On a Saturday morning in late July, he walked to the schoolhouse while she was there alone, setting up the next week's lessons. He stood in the doorway for a moment looking at her, and then he came in and sat in the front bench and put his hat on the desk in front of him. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want to be clear that the answer you give is the right answer, regardless of what it is, and I will not think less of you for anything you say." She sat down across from him. "Ask it then." He looked at her directly. In that way he had that felt like a kind of honesty all its own. "I would like to marry you," he said. "I would like to spend my life with you in this town, in whatever way that looks like when we figure it out together. I am not an easy man in all respects. I carry things that I cannot always put into words, but I love you and I believe you know that, and I believe it is mutual, and I would like to start from there." It was the most she had ever heard him say at once. She knew what it had cost him, and she felt the gift of it precisely. "It is mutual," she said. "And yes, the answer is yes." Yes. He reached across the desk and took her hand the way he had in the rain, careful and certain, and she held his, and they stayed like that for a moment in the schoolhouse where she had hung the alphabet and fixed the window frame and found something she had not known she was missing. "One thing," she said. "Name it." "I keep teaching," she said. "After we're married, I keep the school." He nodded immediately, without hesitation, without the fractional pause that would have told her he was managing his surprise. "Of course you do," he said. "Redemption Creek would fall apart without that school in a year." She laughed then, fully and freely, and he smiled, and it was the first time she had seen him smile entirely without restraint, and she decided it was one of her favorite things she had encountered in her entire life. They were married in August, in the little white church on the rise above town, on a morning when the sky was the precise blue of something from a painting, and the air still held the relative cool of early morning before the heat took over. Reverend Ames kept the ceremony blessedly brief. He had apparently been spoken to on this subject in advance, though by whom Opal never definitively determined. Harriet had helped her alter a dress she had brought from Missouri, ivory cotton with small pearl buttons down the front, and had contributed a length of blue ribbon from her sewing box, with the firmly stated declaration that it was something blue and something borrowed, and that if Opal argued she would put it back in the box. Opal had not argued. Elias stood at the front of the church in his clean black coat, his badge absent for once, and when she walked down the aisle escorted by Miguel Reyes, whom she had asked because he was a good man, and because she had no family close enough to travel, she saw him look at her with an expression so undefended and warm that she had to take a quiet breath to keep her own composure. They said their vows in the plain, direct language of the time, and meant every syllable. When Reverend Ames declared them husband and wife, a cheer went up from the assembled congregation that was loud enough to rattle the windows, and someone outside, she suspected Deputy Crane, fired 2 shots into the air, which was perhaps not strictly appropriate but was completely in character. The reception was in the street outside, tables carried from the saloon and the boarding house, food contributed by what seemed to be most of the town. The Vega family brought tamales and a fiddle, and there was dancing until well past the hour when it became technically tomorrow. Rosa Reyes fell asleep on a pile of coats in the corner and had to be carried home by her father. Harriet danced with the Reverend, which was a development that surprised everyone. Opal danced with her husband, and he danced better than she had expected, not fancy but sure-footed and present, his hand warm at her waist, his eyes on her face with that particular expression she was beginning to understand was simply how he looked at her. "Are you happy?" he asked her during a quieter moment at the edge of the dancing. She looked around at the lantern-lit street, at the people she had come to know and care about over these months, at the starry Texas sky above it all, and then at his face. "Enormously," she said. He brought her hand up and kissed it, simply and without ceremony, and she thought that that was entirely characteristic of him, to do the most quietly significant thing in the least theatrical way possible. They moved into the house that Elias had been renting at the edge of town, a 4-room frame house with a covered porch and a live oak tree in the yard that threw good shade in the afternoons. It was not large, but it was solid, and Opal looked at it the way she looked at everything, as a thing full of potential that had not yet been fully realized. Within 2 weeks she had put up curtains, organized the kitchen with the logic of someone who actually cooked rather than someone who merely occupied a room containing a stove, and started a garden on the south side of the house. Elias contributed to this process in his characteristically practical way, putting up a gate, repairing a loose board in the porch floor, building her a proper bookshelf for the sitting room where she lined up her modest but carefully selected collection. They settled into each other with the same ease they had settled into friendship, which was not ease exactly so much as rightness, the particular alignment of 2 people who have found the person they think in the same general direction as. They disagreed occasionally, not often but with the honest specificity of people who took each other seriously. She thought he worked too many hours. He thought she carried too much of the town's problems home in her head. They were both right, and both slowly learned the other's rhythms the way you learn the particular character of a river you intend to live beside. He told her things in the evenings that she did not think he told anyone else. Small things and large things both, the specific difficulty of maintaining law in a town where the law was still, in many respects, being invented, the residual weight of the war and what it had asked of him, the way he still thought of Clara sometimes, not with active grief, but with the settled awareness of someone who had been important, the things he had hoped his life might look like when he was young, and the ways in which it had turned out differently and better than he had planned. She told him about the freedmen's school again, more fully this time, and about what it had felt like to stand in the ashes of a building where children had learned to read and decide to walk into the one next door and open the windows. She told him about her father, who had been a schoolteacher himself and who had died when she was 18, and how the grief of it had redirected her in ways she was still only partly understanding. She told him about her precise opinion on the educational philosophy of Horace Mann versus the practical reality of a one-room schoolhouse in Texas, and he listened to every word with genuine attention, and asked 3 follow-up questions that demonstrated he had understood not just the argument but the underlying conviction. "You never stop thinking," he said once, with an admiration that was not complicated by any desire for her to do otherwise. "Is that a complaint?" she asked. "It is absolutely not a complaint," he said. The fall brought the term of school and the harvest and a visit from the county sheriff, a man named Beaumont Wallace, who came to discuss a proposed reorganization of the law enforcement territories in the region. Elias spent 2 days in meetings that left him quiet and slightly drawn, and on the second evening Opal sat beside him on the porch and waited. "They want me to take the county sheriff position," he said eventually. "Wallace is retiring. They're looking for someone." She turned to look at him. "Is that something you want?" "It would mean more travel, more territory to cover." He rubbed the back of his neck. "It would mean being away from home more than I like." She held his gaze. "Is that the only thing stopping you?" He was quiet for a moment. "I'd have to appoint a new town sheriff, someone competent. Crane might be ready." "He's ready," she said. She had been watching Deputy Crane for months. He was steady and fair and had the particular combination of firmness and patience that the work required. Elias looked at her carefully. "You be all right with the travel, the weeks when I'm not here?" "I would not love it," she said honestly. "But if it is the right thing for you and for this region, then yes, I would be all right." She paused. "And I have 18 children to look after during the day, so I will not be without occupation." He almost smiled. Then he was serious again. "I want to know what you want, Opal, not what you'll accommodate, what you want." She thought about it properly, which he deserved. "I want you to take whatever position lets you do the most good," she said. "I believe that is this one, and I want us to find a way to make it work so that the weeks you're home are fully home." She reached over and took his hand. "We will manage it." He squeezed her hand and looked out at the street. "I'll write to Wallace tomorrow," he said. "I'll take it." He was appointed county sheriff in October, and Deputy Crane became the new town sheriff of Redemption Creek, a transition that was handled with the minimum of fuss and the maximum of genuine congratulation from the town. Elias' first weeks in the new role took him south into the ranch territories and north toward the river counties, tracking a cattle theft operation that had been moving through the region for months. He wrote to her when he could, brief, direct letters that were nonetheless entirely himself, containing exactly what he meant and nothing superfluous, the way he spoke. She wrote back at length because that was how she was, and she was not going to change the way she communicated to match a frontier expectation of female brevity. She told him everything: the school, the children's progress, what Harriet had said at breakfast, the state of the garden, what she was reading, what she was thinking about. She told him once, in a letter that she wrote on a quiet Sunday, that she had not understood fully until she was writing to him how much she wanted to tell him things, how the desire to share what she observed and thought with a specific other person was itself a kind of love. He wrote back, "I read your letters at the end of the day, and it is the best part of the day. I am not a man of many words on paper, but that is the truest thing I can say." She kept that letter in the small wooden box on her bedside table where she had always kept the things that mattered. He was home for a week in November, and she understood immediately and completely why she wanted him home. Not for company exactly, though she had missed his particular company more than she had let herself fully register while he was away. It was something more specific, the sense of being seen by someone who knew all of you and chose to stay. He brought that with him when he walked in the door, along with trail dust and a weariness she said about remedying, and the house felt different with him in it, full in a way she was too honest not to acknowledge. They sat by the fire that first evening, and she told him everything that had happened while he was gone, and he told her about the cattle theft case, which had been resolved with the arrest of 4 men in a town called Laredo, and a legal process he expected to last the better part of the next year. He ate 3 servings of supper and looked at her over the table with the particular expression she had come to think of as simply his, the one that said she was what he was looking at, and he had no interest in looking at anything else. "I missed you," she said, because she said true things. "I missed you every day." he said. I'm going to spend the next year making the territory as lawful as possible so that the trips get shorter. She laughed at that. That is the most romantic thing you have said to me. That can't be true, he said, slightly wounded. I'm teasing you, she said fondly, although the sincerity of it is genuinely affecting. He shook his head and looked into the fire, and she could see him trying not to smile and losing the fight. The following spring brought unexpected news of the kind that makes a person sit very still for a minute and then laugh and then be very quiet again while they work through the enormity of it. Opal was going to have a child. She had suspected for 2 weeks before she was certain, and she was certain before she told Elias, who was home for a 10-day stretch in April. She told him at breakfast, straightforwardly, because she did not know how to be otherwise. He set down his coffee cup and looked at her with an expression she had not seen before, not the composed steadiness she knew, not even the undefended warmth she had learned to expect in private moments, but something rower than both, something that moved across his face the way weather moves across an open plain, visible from a long distance. "Opal," he said. "I know," she said gently. He was quiet for another moment. "A child." He said it like a man testing the weight of a word. Then he looked at her with that raw, honest thing still in his face. How are you feeling?" "Well," she said. "A little tired, but well." He got up from the table and came around to her side and took her face in both hands carefully and looked at her. "I am," he started and then stopped and started again. "I did not think I would have this again," he said. "I thought that was over. And I want you to know that I am." He stopped again, which was so unlike him that she could feel the weight of what he was trying to carry past the boundary of words. "I know," she said again softly. She put her hands over his. "I know." He pressed his forehead to hers, and they stayed like that for a long moment in the morning kitchen with the spring light coming through the window. And she thought she had never loved him as completely as she did right then, in the inadequacy of language and the completeness of presence. He rearranged his schedule for the next months so that the longer trips were compressed and the weeks home were extended, and she did not ask him to, and he did not announce it. She simply noticed it and understood what it meant and was grateful without making him feel surveilled. They moved through the pregnancy together with the same practical mutual attention they brought to everything else in their shared life. He took over more of the garden. She continued teaching until June, by which time she was sufficiently far along that it was physically demanding, and the substitute teacher the county board sent was, blessedly, competent. Harriet was a constant presence, which was both her right as the woman who had been the closest thing to family in Redemption Creek since Opal arrived, and entirely welcome. She had opinions about everything from diet to room preparation to the proper weight of infant blankets, and most of her opinions turned out to be right, which Opal acknowledged with the fairness that characterized her generally. The baby arrived on a September morning early, with the particular stubborn determination that Opal privately thought was entirely appropriate. It was a boy. They named him Samuel, for no specific reason except that when Elias said it quietly in the examining room while the midwife worked, it had the sound of a name that fit. Elias held his son in the afternoon light of the bedroom, and Opal watched his face from the bed where she was tired and entirely at peace, and she thought she had never seen him more completely himself than in that moment. The careful steadiness, the depth of feeling, the way he looked at something he loved. "Hello, Samuel," he said very quietly to the baby who regarded him with the unfocused new attention of the newborn. "I'm your father." She closed her eyes and listened to the sound of that. Samuel Redmond grew with the particular combination of speed and slowness that characterizes the first year of a child's life, seemingly nothing changing from one day to the next, and then suddenly, all at once, enormous. He had Opal's green eyes and Elias' dark hair, and a temperament that seemed to blend the best of both, curious and composed in roughly equal parts. By the following spring he was pulling himself upright against the furniture with enormous satisfaction, and Elias, who was home for a longer stretch than usual, the county territory having settled somewhat into law, was there for the first uncertain steps across the sitting room floor, which was a thing Opal had not been certain he would be present for, and which she could see had mattered to him in a way he would carry quietly for years. Life in Redemption Creek had changed in the years since Opal arrived. The school had grown. She had lobbied the county board successfully for a second room and a second teacher, and the expanded school now served over 30 children, including several from the surrounding ranches who boarded in town during the week. Tamaz Reyes, her first brilliant mathematics student, had gone to San Antonio the previous year to continue his education, a development she considered one of the highest points of her professional life. Rosa still lived in town and had become Opal's most devoted helper, appearing at the school on afternoons to organize the younger students with a cheerful authority that reminded Opal of someone she could not quite place, until Harriet pointed out that it reminded her of Opal herself. The town had continued its slow accumulation of people and purpose. New businesses, new families, new arguments, and new alliances. The injustices of the frontier were not absent. They were baked into the structure of the land and the law and the competing interests of men with different kinds of power, and Opal and Elias both, in their different capacities, spent considerable energy pushing against them with whatever tools they had. He enforced the law without preference, which in the 1870s in Texas was a more radical act than it should have been. She taught every child who walked through the door with the same energy and expectation, which was equally radical in its own register. There were difficulties. There were seasons when the work was exhausting, and the results were uncertain, and the gaps between what was and what should be seemed too wide to bridge. There were nights when Elias came home from difficult weeks in the territory with a heaviness she could see and could not entirely lift, only sit beside while it passed. There were days when she was so tired from the school and from Samuel and from the accumulated weight of caring about so many things that she sat on the porch in the evenings and could not summon the energy to read, only to breathe. But the difficulty was not the whole of it, and neither of them had ever believed it should be. In the autumn of 1878, 4 years after Opal had stepped off the stagecoach into a gunshot afternoon in Redemption Creek, she was sitting at the kitchen table in the early morning, Samuel asleep in the next room, a cup of coffee in front of her, writing in her journal. It was something she had done since girlhood, this private accounting of days. She was writing about what it felt like to live in this particular place at this particular time. And she was writing about the specific quality of what she had found here, not the ease of it, because it had not always been easy, but the rightness of it, the way a life can be genuinely yours rather than something you are moving through. Elias came in from the back door, having been up early to see to the horse, and he poured himself a cup of coffee and sat across from her at the table without saying anything, because it was early and he respected her morning writing the way she respected his morning quiet. The light was coming in the east window in long gold bars that crossed the table between them. He looked up after a while and caught her looking at him. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said and smiled. He watched her with that expression she loved, the one that had first appeared on the porch in rainy June and had never entirely gone away. "You've been writing for 40 minutes," he said. "What are you thinking about?" She considered the question and him, his face in the morning light, the way 4 years had settled him, deepened the lines at the corners of his eyes without hardening anything. "I'm thinking about arriving here," she said, "about the first day." "The stagecoach," he said. "You walked into a bank robbery without flinching." "I flinched internally," she said. "You didn't look it," he said. He wrapped both hands around his cup. "I thought you were either the bravest person I'd ever seen or you didn't understand what was happening." "I understood," she said. "I had simply decided to see what came next." He looked at her for a long moment. "That is the truest possible description of you," he said. She reached across the table and he met her hand with his, the same gesture as the creek path in summer, comfortable now with years of repetition, still carrying the same weight. From the other room came the sound of Samuel waking, a tentative, exploratory sound that would escalate into a genuine declaration of mourning if not attended to within the next several minutes. "I'll get him," Elias said, standing. She watched him go, the easy walk she knew, the careful way he opened the bedroom door, and she heard his voice, low and warm, saying, "Good morning, Samuel," and Samuel's reply. The 12-syllable babble of a 2-year-old who had a great deal to say even when the words weren't fully assembled yet. And she sat in the morning light with her coffee and her journal and the full, certain knowledge that this was her life, right here, and it was good. The news that a second child was coming arrived the following spring, and this time the process was familiar enough to hold the joy without the same astonishment. They told Samuel, who was old enough to process the concept if not fully its implications, and he thought about it for several days, and then announced that the baby should be named Horse, which they acknowledged with the seriousness it deserved and gently declined. Elias was home more in these years, having trained a capable deputy to handle the eastern section of his territory, and having structured his work so that the longest trips were the exception rather than the rule. He was still the county sheriff, still carried the weight of it, but he had learned, they had both learned, that the weight could be set down sometimes without losing the commitment to pick it back up. The second child arrived on a warm evening in October, and it was a daughter. They lay awake half the night talking about names with Samuel asleep in the next room and the baby between them on the bed, this new small person regarding the lantern light with serious eyes. They considered and rejected a dozen names. Finally, in the quietness of nearly midnight, Opal said a name that had been in the back of her mind for months without her fully acknowledging it. "Clara," she said. She looked at Elias carefully. "I was thinking Clara, if you would like." He was very still for a moment. He looked at the baby, and then at Opal with an expression that contained grief and gratitude and love all layered over each other, and she understood that the offering of that name had said something she had meant to say. "Yes," he said, simply and firmly. "Clara." She reached for his hand in the dark and held it, and the baby Clara Redmond made a small certain sound and went back to sleep. The years continued in the way that good years do, not without difficulty, but with a fundamental rightness that makes the difficulties bearable and sometimes even clarifying. Samuel grew into a boy who liked horses and mathematics, and had his mother's stubborn curiosity and his father's economy of expression, a combination that made him excellent company and occasionally infuriating in arguments. Clara developed what Harriet called a personality worth reckoning with from approximately the age of 6 months, and had not softened it in any meaningful respect since. Harriet Holly's remained the immovable center of the boarding house and a constant presence in all their lives. She had, in the years since the wedding, become something close to family, the kind that is chosen rather than given and consequently valued more precisely. She adored both children with an unsentimental, deeply genuine devotion, and had opinions about their upbringing that she offered freely, and with the confidence of someone whose track record of being right about this particular household was essentially unblemished. Deputy, now Sheriff Crane, had married a woman named Helen who had come to Redemption Creek as a dressmaker and had promptly become one of the most quietly important people in the town. She and Opal had the particular friendship of two women who respected each other's intelligence and were willing to be honest, which is both rarer and more valuable than most other kinds. Miguel Reyes's homestead had grown and his family had prospered, and the day that Tomás Reyes came back to Redemption Creek from San Antonio with a teaching certificate and took over the second classroom at the school was one of the happiest days of Opal's professional life. She cried in private, which was her right, and was composed and dignified at the welcome supper, which was her nature. In the summer of 1882, on a long warm evening when the children were in bed and the town was quiet, and the air smelled of cedar and late roses from the garden, Opal and Elias sat on the porch of their house with the particular companionship of people who have no performance left to give each other, only the simple fact of being there. She was reading. He was watching the darkening sky with his coffee cup in his hand, and the live oak tree threw its shadow across the yard, and the crickets had started up in the grass along the fence line. "Elias," she said, without looking up from her book. "What are you thinking about?" A pause. "The barn could use a new door," he said. "And whether it's going to rain this week." She looked up at him. He was looking at her with that expression, the one that had been there since the beginning, that she now understood was not something that changed or diminished with time, but rather deepened, grew more specific, became more completely what it was. "And," she said, the corner of his mouth curved, "and I was thinking that I am, on balance, the luckiest man in this county." She set her book down. "On balance," she said, amused. "That's the most qualified superlative I've ever heard." "I qualified it for accuracy," he said. "The barn door is genuinely concerning." She laughed, and he watched her laugh with that same quiet, attentive joy, and the evening settled around them, warm and certain. From inside the house came the sound of Clara's voice, not distressed, just awake and making the nocturnal pronouncements that Clara was known for. Elias stood, setting his cup on the railing. "I'll go," he said. She listened to his footsteps through the house, and then his voice in Clara's room, low and patient, answering whatever declaration Clara was making with the same full attention he brought to every conversation regardless of the speaker's age. From the other room, Samuel's breathing was audible in the quiet, steady and deep, the sound of a child entirely at peace. She sat on the porch in the warm dark and looked out at the street below, and the stars above, and the town that she had arrived in 8 years ago with a traveling bag and a teaching certificate, and no particular plan beyond starting over somewhere that needed what she had to give. She thought about all of it, the stagecoach and the gunshot and the toolbox left behind in the schoolhouse, the walk in the rain and the creek path in summer, and the letter from Theodore that had arrived like a test and been resolved like a conclusion. The wedding in the little white church with the too long shortened ceremony, and the dancing in the street. The children and the nights of talking and the mornings of comfortable silence and all the days between. She thought about the freedmen's school she had reopened in the building next door and the students who had learned to read in the middle of a world that had tried to prevent them. And she thought about what that had taught her about where things could be rebuilt and where they needed to be. And she thought the answer was always, wherever you are, in whatever building is standing, with whatever tools remain. She heard Elias' footsteps returning through the house. He came out the door and settled back into his chair with the ease of someone returning to the right place, and picked up his coffee cup. "She's decided it's daytime," he said. "She's decided it's daytime every third night," Opal said. "She'll grow out of it. You've been saying that for a year and a half. I remain optimistic." He shook his head, half smiling, and looked out at the street. After a moment he reached over and rested his hand on hers on the arm of her chair, and she turned her hand over and held it, and they sat like that in the summer evening while the crickets sang in the grass and the stars came on overhead in their usual abundance over the Texas sky. She squeezed his hand once. He squeezed back. There was nothing left to explain or resolve or find. It was all here, in this porch, in this town, in this particular life they had made, and it was exactly and completely enough. Redemption Creek did not stop requiring things of them, because places never do, and neither of them would have wanted it to. The school continued to grow. By the fall of 1883, Tomás Reyes had hired a third teacher, and the county board had officially recognized Redemption Creek as having one of the highest literacy rates in the region, a fact that Opal noted in her journal with satisfaction and no surprise whatsoever. She had known it was possible from the moment she walked through the schoolhouse door and found the warped floor and the broken window pane, and understood them as problems that had solutions. Elias continued to serve as county sheriff through the early 1880s, the frontier's particular lawlessness continuing to require the specific combination of firmness and fairness that he had brought to it from the beginning. He was known throughout the county by this point as a man who enforced the law without bending it for wealth or influence, which was not a neutral position in the political climate of the time, and which cost him on occasion in terms of powerful men's approval, which he found he could live without. There was one winter, in 1883, when a dispute between two large ranching operations over a shared water source in a dry season grew dangerous enough that Elias spent 3 weeks negotiating a legal agreement that required every skill he had and then some. He came home from it tired in a way that went deeper than his body, and Opal recognized it as the particular exhaustion of a person who has spent weeks carrying other people's worst instincts away from catastrophe through sheer force of will and steadiness. She sat beside him on the evening he came home, in the sitting room with the fire going and the children asleep, and she did not tell him it would be all right or diminish what he had carried. She simply said, "Tell me what happened," and she listened to every word, and when he was done she said, "You did well," and meant it as the precise, serious compliment it was. He looked at her. "How do you do that?" he said. "Do what?" "Know what to say." She considered this honestly. "I pay attention," she said. "You are not a difficult man to read when someone is paying attention." He was quiet for a moment. "I told Clara today that she has your eyes," he said. "You told her that at dinner," she said. "She said she wanted them to stay where they were." He laughed, genuinely and freely, and she felt the exhaustion leave him somewhat, the way warmth releases a frozen thing. She put her arm through his and leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat together in the firelight, while the house settled around them, and the winter dark pressed against the windows outside. In the spring of 1884, a decade after Opal's arrival, Redemption Creek held a celebration for the town's 20th year as an incorporated municipality, which was observed with a 3-day festival that involved a fair, a fiddle competition, a horse race on the flat land east of town, and a supper that Harriet Hollies organized with the military precision she brought to all large-scale domestic operations. The town's population had grown substantially in 10 years, and looking out at the crowd assembled for the celebration, Opal could identify almost every face and knew most of their names and many of their stories. She stood with Elias at the edge of the gathering and watched Samuel, who was 9, racing around the field with Miguel Reyes's younger grandchildren, with the focused intensity of a boy who competed in everything, and lost with slightly more grace than he used to. Clara, who was 6 and had recently entered the school as a student, a situation that Opal had navigated carefully, making absolutely certain that Clara received the same treatment as every other child, was sitting on a blanket with Rosa Reyes's daughter, deep in a private conversation of apparently enormous significance. "What do you think they're talking about?" Elias said, watching Clara. "The mechanics of the universe," Opal said, "or horses, either equally." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, comfortable and certain, watching their children in the afternoon light. Harriet appeared beside them with 2 cups of lemonade and a look of general satisfaction. "20 years," she said, handing them the cups. "This town has grown up." "It has," Opal agreed. "So have you too," Harriet said, with the specific quality of someone who has watched a thing from the beginning and is privately very pleased about how it turned out. She moved off into the crowd before either of them could respond. "I've always been grown up," Elias said. "You've always seemed grown up," Opal corrected. "There's a meaningful distinction. I remember a man who had closed himself off so completely that he wasn't sure anyone was worth opening for." He looked at her sideways. "Did Mrs. Hollies tell you that?" "I observed it directly," she said. "You were not subtle." "I thought I was subtle." "You were not." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a protest. Then he was quiet for a moment, looking out at the celebration. "I'm glad you were not deterred," he said simply. She looked at him. "I was never going to be deterred," she said. "I reopened a burned-down school in the building next door. Caution was not my primary characteristic." "No," he agreed. He pressed a kiss to her temple there in the middle of the town's celebration, not caring who saw, which for Elias Redmond was practically a public declaration. It was not. She held her lemonade and leaned against him, and watched their children and their town and their friends in the wide Texas afternoon. And she thought about the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach 10 years ago into a burst of chaos, with a traveling bag and an unbudgeable belief that things could be made better. She thought that woman would be entirely satisfied with where she had landed, not because things had become easy, but because they had become real and full and thoroughly, completely hers. Samuel Redmond grew into a young man who would have been recognizable as his parents' son to anyone who knew them. He had his mother's directness and his father's patience and a deep love of horses that was all his own. By the time he was 15, he was helping at the livery on weekends and had an opinion about every horse in the county that he expressed with the calm authority of someone considerably older. Clara, 3 years younger, had the same authority and deployed it more frequently and in more subjects. Elias retired from the county sheriff's position in the fall of 1886 at the age of 49. The frontier had quieted considerably, and the position now required more administration and politics than the kind of work he had been built for, and he was honest with himself and with Opal about the fact that it was time. He spent a winter that was initially too quiet. She saw him working through the adjustment, the loss of that particular kind of purpose, and she did not rush it or paper over it with false reassurance. And then in the spring he began working with Deputy Crane on special cases, the complex ones that required experience and judgment, an arrangement that suited everyone and gave him what he needed without binding him to a role that had run its course. She kept teaching. She would keep teaching, she said, for as long as she was able, which she estimated would be some time yet. The school had become one of the things Redemption Creek was known for in the region, and young teachers came now to train under her before going on to their own posts, which she found both gratifying and occasionally humbling. In the evening of that quiet retirement winter, on one of the nights when the adjustment was sitting heavily on him, and he was restless in a way he couldn't quite articulate, she said to him, "You have spent 30 years making things safer and more just for people who needed it. That does not stop being true because the title has changed." He looked at her. "You are the same man," she said. "The work does not define that, you do." He held her gaze for a long moment. "Then I don't know what I would have done without you in this life." "You would have managed," she said. "You are fundamentally competent and I have always respected that, but I believe it would have been considerably quieter and less argumentative." He smiled, slowly and fully, with no restraint at all. "Considerably," he agreed. The town of Redemption Creek in the latter part of the 1880s was a different place from the rough frontier settlement Opal had arrived in, and it was a better place in most of the ways that matter. It was not perfect. She was far too clear-eyed to claim perfection for anything involving human beings, but it was a place where a child could learn to read regardless of their name or their father's birthplace, where the law was enforced without preference for the powerful, where a woman could run a school and argue with the county board, and own her own opinions without apology, and where a man who had closed himself up after grief could find that he was not finished, after all. Samuel was apprenticed to a horse trader in the county by the time he was 17, with plans to run his own operation by 20, which struck everyone who knew him as entirely plausible. Clara had already told her mother at the age of 12 that she intended to be a doctor, which in 1886 was a declaration that required a particular kind of courage, and which Opal received without flinching, and with the immediate practical response of writing to the Women's Medical College in Philadelphia for information. "A doctor," Elias said that evening, with the mildly stunned expression of a man still processing a large piece of news. "She's been tending to every injured animal in the county since she was 4 years old," Opal said. "Did you think she was going to do something else?" He considered this. "No," he admitted. "I suppose not. Good, Opal said. Because the information from Philadelphia is very encouraging and I intend to help her get there. He looked at her with that expression, that particular, unchanging expression, and said, "Of course you do." On an evening in the spring of 1887, 13 years after Opal stepped off a stagecoach into a gunshot afternoon and met the sheriff of Redemption Creek over the scattered pages of her sheet music and the chaos of a bank robbery, she sat on the porch of the house she had made a home, with the live oak tree still throwing its wide shadow across the yard and the garden along the south side of the house coming up green and promising. The street below was quiet. The day had been warm and was settling into a cool, cedar-scented evening. Elias brought 2 cups of coffee from inside and sat beside her and handed her one, and she took it and held it and looked out at the town. "Samuel writes that the buyer in Laredo is interested in the whole string," she said. "If it goes through, it will be a significant start." "It'll go through," Elias said. "He knows horses." "He knows horses from you," she said. "He knows everything from you," Elias said. "The horses are the only contribution I can reliably claim." She smiled into her coffee. The evening deepened. A mockingbird somewhere in the oak tree ran through its repertoire with the diligent creativity of its kind. From down the street came the quiet sound of the town settling into evening, the last movement of people between buildings, a horse at the livery, a door closing. "Harriet says she's going to reduce the boarding house to 4 rooms next year," Elias said. "She's getting tired." "She'll never stop entirely," Opal said. "She'd disappear without something to manage." "You'd fill the gap," he said. "I manage a school," she said. "That is sufficient management." He looked at her with the easy attention of all these years, and she looked back at him, and there was nothing in the look that needed to be explained or translated. It was simply 2 people who knew each other entirely and had chosen to stay. "Clara wrote to say she wants to visit the college herself," Opal said. "Next summer." "We'll take her," Elias said without hesitation. She looked at him. "Philadelphia." "I haven't been east of the Mississippi since the war," he said. "It seems like time." She thought about that, the 2 of them and Clara on a train east, through the hill country and the plains, and into the dense, different world of the eastern cities. The idea contained within it something that pleased her deeply, not just the journey itself but the shape of a life that still had journeys in it, that was still opening rather than closing. "All right," she said. "Next summer." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, as natural as breathing, as certain as the live oak and the creek and the mockingbird in the branches. The stars were coming on overhead in the wide Texas sky, one by one and then all together, as they did every evening over Redemption Creek. She thought about what she would write in her journal tonight. She thought she would write about the sound of the town settling in the evening and the smell of cedar and coffee and spring, and about the man beside her with his particular steadiness and his quiet depth, and the way he had looked at her from the beginning, as though she was something worth looking at. She would write about her children growing into themselves with a confidence she hoped she had helped give them. She would write about all the children she had taught over these years, the ones who had learned to read in the schoolhouse with the repaired window and the new benches, the ones who had gone on to other places, carrying the tools she had given them. And she would write about sitting on this porch in this town in this life, with everything she had ever wanted not given to her but built, steadily and deliberately, the way things are built when you believe they are worth building. She tilted her head back and looked at the stars. Elias followed her gaze upward. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She considered it honestly, the way she always did when he asked her something real. She thought about Missouri and the schoolhouse fire and the stagecoach and the gunshot and the toolbox and the rain and the creek and the wedding and Samuel and Clara and all of it. This whole extraordinary, ordinary life. "I'm thinking," she said slowly, "that I am exactly where I am supposed to be." He was quiet for a moment. Then he pressed his lips to her hair, simply and with all the certainty of a man who has known for a very long time exactly what he is grateful for. "So am I," he said. "So am I." The mockingbird sang on in the oak tree. The stars filled up the sky. The town of Redemption Creek settled into its quiet evening, and on a porch at the edge of the main street, two people sat together in the deep, unshaken peace of a life that had been worth every difficult, beautiful mile of making.